Greetings. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see you. My name is, well, I actually can't see you. I'm glad to have you here in the room. My name is Jess Enoch, and I'm the director of the academic writing program here at UMD. And I'm thrilled to feel this sense of community, even though we're in many ways distanced from each other. It's wonderful to have you all here to listen to this fantastic conversation with Dr. Julius Fleming. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to learn from him today as well. I'd like to welcome Dr. Fleming and all of the English 101 students and teachers and anyone else in the audience today who are zooming in from close or from far away for this thrilling conversation. I also want to thank the members of our AWP team for helping to put this event together. Catherine Bailey, Scott Eklund, Britt Starr, and Lyra Hilliard. Karen Nelson also offered excellent guidance for this new webinar format. And I want to thank Mac Flynn, who is captioning this conversation. Thank you, Mac, for making this meeting accessible. As many of you know, the academic writing program offers a core curriculum that is invested in rhetoric's relationship to civic engagement and social justice. Dr. Fleming's essay, Shattering Black Flesh, Black Intellectual Writing in the Age of Ferguson, is featured in our English 101 syllabus because it showcases the intersections between academic writing and public discourse, revealing not only the porous boundaries between intellectual and public work, but also the urgency in thinking capaciously and writing powerfully about racialized violence. Many of our students and instructors in the audience read this essay in the past few weeks. They have submitted questions that are structuring our conversation today. And we are all eager to hear Dr. Fleming and hear how he wants to reflect on and respond to their inquiries. Before we start our conversation with Dr. Fleming, let me give you a bit of background on my esteemed colleague. Dr. Fleming earned both his doctorate in English and a graduate certificate in Africana Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. His particular interests lie in performance studies, Black political culture, diaspora, and colonialism, especially where they intersect with race, gender, and sexuality. In addition to publishing numerous scholarly articles, Professor Fleming is currently completing his first book manuscript entitled Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Refusal to Wait for Freedom, which is under contract with the New York University Press. This project considers the civil rights movement from the perspective of Black theater, while examining the importance of time and affect to the making of the modern racial order. We are thrilled to have Dr. Fleming here at UMD and as a part of our academic writing program as well. I'd also like to welcome Elizabeth Catchmark to this meeting. Ms. Catchmark is a PhD candidate and academic fellow who works at the intersection of African-American literature, African-American rhetoric, and the medical humanities. Her dissertation reads the long Black freedom struggle through the lens of healthcare advocacy, arguing Black American activists and artists are understudies as theorists of health and developers of policy approaches to national care. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Catchmark. So now Ms. Catchmark and Dr. Fleming will talk about Dr. Fleming's work and how his interests overlap with and energize the work we're trying to do in English 101. Before we get going, I just want to note that we're not using the chat and Q&A function today since we've already received questions from our students and instructors. Thank you to those many people in our community who have submitted such fantastic questions. We're excited for how they're arranging and ordering our event today. So I'm going to turn our conversation over to Elizabeth and Julius. Thank you again. I'm really excited to have you both here, and I'm so appreciative that our community gets to hear you today. So thank you.
Wonderful. So I'll be the stand-in for our students and instructors. We have collected some of your questions into some major sort of themes. And we'll start with the context and inspiration for this piece. So what was happening socially and politically when you were writing this essay that inspired you? How do you see your arguments continuing to address the current moment? And what, if anything, might you change if writing the essay today?
Okay. Sure. I'm just gonna jot. Okay, cool. So first, thanks so much to Jess, to you, Elizabeth, to Karen, and everyone who worked to make this happen. I'm really excited to be here. We did a version of this a few years ago, and it's been one of the highlights of my career as a junior professor. What was going on in 2016? What wasn't going on in 2016? I was living in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia in the Carter G. Woodson Center, which is a center dedicated to the study of African-American life and culture. And as many of you all know, that was the year in Charlottesville where we had the Klan rallies, the Klan marches, the Klan protests. And I was living in an apartment that was about 10 minutes from campus. And I had not heard that these marches would be taking place. And so my wife and I were at the Wegmans, and I get a call from my mom asking if we're okay. And I'm just sort of like, what do you mean if we're okay? The Klan is marching in Charlottesville. And so, that happened. And at the same time, over the course of a couple of years, we had the murders of Black people by police officers, Rakaya, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, all over the United States, right? And as these stories were unfolding, I was deeply impacted and affected by each one of them. And I think there was a way in which I wanted to be numb to the violence in ways that I felt certain people were becoming, but I couldn't. And each unfolding sort of affected me anew. So those things were going on at the same time that the 2016 presidential campaigns were happening, right? And all the vitriol and dog whistling and animosity surrounding that. So I really felt that I wanted to turn to what I do best, which I think is kind of being a thinker and writing, as a way to make sense of this kind of constellation of events and how it was impacting me as I tried to work every single day, right? And so that was the kind of political environment that was surrounding the writing of this piece. In terms of what, I think you asked me, is the piece still relevant? Sadly, I think the answer is yes. I wish they weren't. But yeah, I think, and I think the real answer to that question is that it will always be relevant. In many ways, I think that the kind of modern world was built upon the backs of Black folk, Native folk, other minority people, and anti-Blackness is kind of woven into the fabric and the DNA of the modern world. And so I think these questions around anti-Blackness and inequality, injustice and violence will always be relevant, sadly. And finally, if I could change something, and this is something I normally wouldn't share in public, but I was a little disappointed that I didn't spend as much time talking about Black joy. Every time I reread the piece, it just feels so heavy, and I think it reflects a certain dimension of Black life when lived under the conditions of oppression. And I'm from Mississippi, which of course is kind of ground zero for anti-Blackness. But one thing I learned growing up is a kind of thick sense of joy, and as the old Black people in Mississippi say, a kind of sense of keep on keeping on, even in the worst conditions. And I don't think the piece quite reflected the ways in which Black people or people whose flesh is constantly shattered actually, they not only pick up the pieces, but they pick them up and they find ways of creating joy and living life. And I don't think the piece quite reflected that.
Thank you. So one thing I heard in your response there that I wanted to check in on is it seemed that the research process for you and the writing process for you was almost a way of working through this moment. Like there was this moment of sort of profound crisis, and you found the process of writing and research to be a way to sort of process that and cope with it. And I wanted to know if you could talk about that a little bit more. How does research experienced for you in that way, and how have you found it be a resource for coping through issues like the ones you address in your paper?
Yeah, so research, especially in the field of kind of like cultural studies, Black studies, it helps you to understand where these things come from. It helps you to understand that these things have a long, long history. But it also, just to be honest, it provided an outlet. I was a young professor who had just started the tenure track. And I had friends who were sort of marching in the street and who were vocal on Facebook and who looked like they were being kind of legitimate activists. And so I could always turn to my research as a way of saying, oh, I too am busy. And it essentially offered an outlet, right, in some ways. But a part of what I started to discover was that research process was also a site of trauma. As I'm reading about and studying lynching, and as I'm studying the civil rights movement, and little girls are being bombed, and churches are being blown up, and civil rights leaders are being shot. the kind of resonances between what I was studying and what was unfolding around me were sometimes too heavy, right? And so that the research process was also a site of trauma. And so I had to find a way of negotiating that kind of kept my health intact.
Thank you. Yeah. So a second question that our students posed was thinking through sort of what might have changed or not changed since your writing. Many of our students were wondering if activism and protest has made a difference, to use their language, if politicians and officials can work to combat white supremacy, and if their own work and writing participates in anti-racism, which I think you were gesturing towards just now. So what are your thoughts about the idea of progress or difference across time? Are there other ways of understanding justice work that don't rely on the term progress? And where does that leave individual and collective action?
That's an easy question. So I'm naturally optimistic, right? Or maybe it's not naturally optimistic. I've been conditioned to be optimistic by the people who raised me, my family. And so, yeah, I think that progress is real and that progress happens. And, you know, this question about can politicians be anti-racist or participate in anti-racism, I think that most people can learn to be anti-racist and participate in initiatives that are designed to create an anti-racist society. I really do believe that most people can get there. And I'm saying this as someone who's from Mississippi, where, you know, there's a kind of naked investment in anti-Blackness and racial violence. So I am overly kind of maybe sometimes overly optimistic, but I'm very optimistic because if I even take my department as an example, right, the University of Maryland, when I started this job in 2014, I was the only Black tenure track faculty male in a department of about 60 people, right? That was in 2014, and now it's 2020. We've hired 3 other Black men. We've hired a Black woman. I have other Black women colleagues. I've seen other parts of the faculty diversify. I've seen the front office staff diversify. The University of Maryland now has an African-American president. And similar changes are happening in other kind of dimensions and domains of society. And so I do believe in progress, and I do think that that measurable structural progress is possible and happening. I think the thing that I'll add, though, is that we have to be careful. One thing that research shows us, and that studying the history of Black life or Black flesh shows us, is that whenever there has been significant Black progress, whether it's right after the Civil War during Reconstruction, or whether it's right after the Civil Rights Movement, right, or whether it's right after Barack Obama's presidency, there's always been some kind of rollback, right? Whether it's conservative Supreme Court rulings that gut the Voting Rights Act, or whether we get our current president as a response to Barack Obama, right? I think this is a part of what Black Studies tells us, is that whenever there's any degree of measurable Black progress, there will be a sizable backlash. And so we have to then figure out how to readjust and move forward in the wake of that backlash.
That's an excellent answer. And I'm wondering too, in thinking about your previous answer, because what we're talking about a little bit is the sort of the consistency across time of white supremacy, that it's sort of, and also its sort of flexibility, that it can always reorganize and develop new ways of structuring violence, anti-Black violence. But I think one thing you're also attending us to is that just as intractable is Black joy and Black humanity, is that we can locate, just as much as we can always locate systems of oppression and systems of violence, we can also always locate joy. We can always locate the full expression of humanity. So I wonder if that's part of sort of what you're suggesting too, is that there is this progress framework that's useful in some ways, but there's also sort of a useful way of thinking about things not changing, is that Black humanity is always full and rich and beautiful and worth attending to.
Absolutely. I think I can't put that any better than you just did. Yeah.
I'm so glad. Okay. So our students were also wondering, so you're talking about your research and your work with sort of such passion and how it sort of fits in with your values and sort of your perspective on justice. So our students were wondering, how did you grow to be so passionate about your work? And did you have any experiences that shaped your passion and helped you come to this career?
Yeah, I think really life experience. And I know that's like a taboo answer when talking about one's work, but growing up in a place where there's kind of just overwhelming poverty, growing up in a state where, we were expected to be last in everything. And when we beat Alabama, Arkansas, there was a party. saw what it looked like to live in a world that wasn't the world I wanted to leave behind. And I was nurtured by family members, by teachers, by professors. I went to a historically Black college, Tougaloo College in Mississippi. I was nurtured by an undergraduate mentor and a team of mentors who constantly instilled in me that you want to leave this world better than you found it, right? And so that's been my kind of overarching goal. How do I leave this world better than I found it? And of course, I take up that task in my work. And so what that means is when I do a lot of archival work because I like to leave my intellectual world kind of better than I found it by expanding what I knew when I first started as a scholar and sort of leaving something for scholars who come behind me, but also on things like my mentorship. I spend a lot of time working on personal statements, mentoring students who are preparing to go to graduate school, because those are the kind of building blocks, I think, for leaving the world better than I found it. And it's easy to be passionate about that for me, because I think the alternative, the way that my mind works, is to become pessimistic. And right now I have a lot of friends who are very pessimistic. And there's even an intellectual camp in Black studies, as you know, that is centered around pessimism. And to avoid that really kind of, I think, misrepresentation of the history of Black people, because Black people have certainly trafficked in pessimism, but overall we've not been a pessimistic bunch. We believed in futurity and possibility. So to keep from falling into that trap of pessimism, I find passion in that kind of goal of leaving the world better than I found it.
Yeah. Oh, no, go ahead.
I just want to say briefly, I realized that I didn't answer part of your last question, which is that I think the students were wondering if their writing could participate in this work of anti-racism. And I think more important than my article or anything that I'll write in my lifetime or my colleagues will write, their writing and their thinking will be the things that actually have more potential to transform the world. And I'm happy to talk about that more later.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll make a note. So one of the things that I love about the answer you just gave for your profession is that you talk about your work and your sort of your official profession as a scholar, but you also talk about the way you take these values into sort of other kind of practices like your mentorship. And I can attest to that too, as someone you've mentored. I can attest that you're an incredibly generous, supportive, wonderful mentor. And I think what's so powerful about that is that there's no, what you're sort of gesturing towards is that there's no justice career, is that you do the work where you are. And that's something that I've seen in your, in my encounters with you, is that wherever you are, you're doing the work. And in whatever kind of work you do it. And I think that that's a really powerful thing you're attending our students to, is that there's no career that does the meaningful work of justice, is that you find how to do it where you are with the people you're interacting with.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the, so I don't really know much about the writing programs here, but like through Jess and Scott and some other people I've come into contact with, I've learned a bit about the things that the students are reading and some of the writing exercises. And I actually think that what you're saying is so profound, because the students in the program, they will go on to become doctors, lawyers, they will work for the government, NASA, you know, whatever it is. And inequality exists in all those locations, right? And all those locations are kind of shaped by inequality. So if we can get students who are reading this piece and who are reading other, you know, pieces that are included in the first year curriculum, in the writing curricula, right, then those people go into society with a different consciousness. They go into society with a different awareness, right, of the environment, and a different kind of desire maybe to change those environments that don't align with the kind of democratic principles that we espouse. And so, yeah, I think that because of that, justice is not a, you know, some people are activists and they dedicate their lives to it, right? And they deserve a trophy because that is really hard work. But I think exactly as you're saying, these other careers have lots of space for us to engage in a similar kind of activism and transform the world as we know it.
Yeah, and that's, I think, another way to think too about this idea of white supremacy as intractable. Because there's no space it hasn't touched, there's no space we can't do the work. Yeah. You know, there's no space that doesn't need anti-racist organizing and anti-racist thinking. So wherever our students are, they can do that kind of work.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned that you don't know much about the writing program. Well, I'm about to explain something about the writing program. So English 101 is based on the process of inquiry, which means we ask thoughtful, open-ended questions to guide our research and consider many different potential answers before making an argument. And also central to our curriculum is that those questions are ethical questions. So we think about what's an ethical question that could produce sort of a really productive, just answer. So your essay for me is just such a beautiful representation of that kind of work, in part because of the refrain of the question, that you ask this sort of important, careful question, and that you explore all these different ways that can be answered. So it's a very open-ended essay. You know, it has lots of sort of approaches. So what advice might you give a student struggling with asking those kinds of questions and doing this kind of work, particularly sitting with the tension of not yet having an answer? And what value do you see in this kind of reflection writing?
Mm. So for the students out there, I still struggle with this. I do teach that it's okay to kind of be ambiguous and to not have the answer, you know, the neat, clean answer that you want. But I still very much struggle with it, like you probably do, because I want the neat, clean answer by the end of the piece. Yeah, I think I'm learning, you know, like the students, I'm learning that not all pieces of writing, not all pieces of thought, not all thought experiments end in neat, tidy answers, right? Sometimes there's ambiguity, sometimes there's uncertainty, but I think even the ambiguity or the uncertainty is an answer, right? It's one answer. And that I think what happens is that if you land in place A, maybe you re-engage that topic later and you will land in place B, right? And so that writing for me is always living, right? It's never done. And so you constantly revisit, expand, update, so that you arrive at new answers maybe 2 years later when you're thinking about the same question. And so, yeah, I think that, and on the kind of point of the question itself, every class that I teach, I have the research students before they submit their final papers. Before they submit their abstracts, I have them to submit their research questions. Because I find that one thing that always happens in every class I teach is that the students come to me and say, hey, can you check my thesis to make sure it's great? Because somehow a great thesis translates into an A. And what I always find is that there's this kind of impulse to have the answer before the work is done to research the thing, or before there's even a question about the thing, right? And so I think I always make them submit their research question, because I think the question is the thing that kind of provides you the foundation to even begin the process of inquiry, right? To begin the process of exploration. And so I think the question is kind of fundamentally important to the process of writing.
Absolutely. And I love your framing of sort of writing is sort of always a living thing, because our students do a lot of revision, they do a lot of thinking through these ideas, and also because it's an inquiry base, they start with the topic and they work with it for about 8 weeks.
Nice.
So just like you mentioned, I think what we're trying to do in 101 is to make students constantly sort of recur. This idea recurs, they come back to it, they have to sit with it for an extended period of time and sit with this sort of not knowing, in the hopes that like there is no sort of that every answer is provisional, is part of what I'm hearing from you, is that every answer, and I think that reflects too on the fact that there's something that you might add to this essay, which we all love and think is so wonderful, is that every answer is provisional, and the research process and the writing process is just an act of making provisional answers that you'll then sort of expand on and think differently about moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And we also, so our next question is a little bit about writing from personal experience, which you sort of touched on already with the idea of how traumatic it can be to write about topics that are important to us. But another feature of English 101 is the way students are encouraged to think about their personal experiences as valuable and important parts of research and writing. So one of the things we really try and challenge here is the idea that you have to be distant from or impartial about these issues to write about them well. It's actually a strength to care a lot about what you're writing about and to have experiences that help you reflect on it. So one of the most powerful components of your essay is the way you incorporate your experiences into your argument. Could you talk a little bit more about what that process was like for you and what advice you would give students about writing with their experiences?
Another easy question. So there has to be, I think balance is the word that comes to mind, right? So I certainly write from my experiences. And you asked me what that felt like, I think, and it was scary, if I'm honest about it. You know, I'm an early career professor, and there are a lot of senior scholars in my field and in the profession who were trained even more than I was in this kind of school of thinking that you have to be quote unquote objective, that you can incorporate personal experience. And the minute you incorporate the personal, then it's somehow no longer valid, right? Or is somehow no longer as rigorous. And so I was kind of scared to write this piece because it's published in American Literary History, which is, you know, one of the top journals in the field. They tend to publish more traditional essays. I was also in this same issue as, Houston Baker, as Dana Williams, as Harvey Young, really kind of distinguished professors in the field. And so I took a risk in writing in this kind of personal register. But I think for me, the payoff was there when I hit submit. And so I was kind of personally ready for whatever consequences might follow. Luckily, it's received, great feedback. But there is a risk in kind of incorporating the personal into academic writing, as important as it is. But I think it's important for me because, writing isn't depersonalized. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Every way in which I frame a thesis, every question that I ask, every answer that I arrive at is informed in part by who I am. And so whether that is spoken or unspoken, whether it's articulated or not, it's very real. And I think there's a way in which some non-minority people think that because they don't write specifically about their identities, that those identities don't find their way into the writing. And those identities absolutely do, right? And so I think it's important for minority people, where possible, to actually name who they are and how, what they are informs their writing and their thinking. And there was another part to the question at the end.
So what advice would you give to students about writing with their experiences? So if I wanted to incorporate my own experience into one of my essays, what might you suggest that I do?
Yeah, so this answer might be a little contentious. There is a school of thinking that, encourages students to use certain kinds of vernaculars, right, that are personal to them, that have shaped their lives. And I have no question about, because thanks to sociolinguists and other people, I have no question about whether those are valid. I think what we have to emphasize, though, is when and where do you choose to activate and rely on and deploy those, knowing the society that we live in. And so I would never have my students, at least, use personal experience or certain kind of vernaculars in certain settings where I know that there are certain standards, and doing so would position them not to be competitive, right? So, for example, I go to a conference called the MLA, as you all know. This is our professional conference. When people go to the MLA, you wear all black. This is just something that we know. There's a way in which you ask a question. There's a way in which you present a paper, right? And so because there's an established culture, I can make the conscious decision to talk about this sort of essay, right? But I would never present this at the MLA. And so I guess a part of what I'm saying is that as important as the personal is, you also have to be very real about the fact that we live in a society that's not always ready for that kind of writing. And then when you choose to tap into it, you have to be ready for the consequences.
Yeah, so there's just so much great there. So the things I heard from the first part of your answer was that it felt like a risk, that it often feels like a risk. And I think that, I don't know if this was fully there, but there's a sense I get a vulnerability if I'm talking from my experience, that there's a sort of more of a risk when you name yourself and know yourself and your compositions. But what I heard that for you was sort of your way through that was to trust your voice, that it was valuable and that it needed to be said, and that you were the person who could say it. The other thing I loved that you mentioned was that writing is always embedded in our identities and experiences, whether you name them or not. And I think that that's almost like one of the ways that racism and white supremacy can shape the way we think about research, is the idea that some people's identities are marked and some aren't. So I think this idea that you could write without personal experience is one that we should really challenge, which I think is what you were pushing us to do, is that we're always writing from personal experience. It's just whether we know and name it or we don't.
Absolutely.
And then as far as your point about language, I think that for our curriculum, one of the things we emphasize is sort of rhetorical choice. The idea of rhetorical choice is that when you're choosing to sort of challenge the boundaries of a genre, it should be a specific choice to create a specific impact. Right. And I think that's a way of thinking about what you were talking about, is that you should always be purposeful in how you craft your writing.
Right. The students should be grateful for this curriculum.
We're so glad. We love it. So we're glad you like it too. Okay. So another key feature of your essay is social media, which our students are also encouraged to engage with in their curriculum. So it emerges several times in your essay, both in examples of the Black intellectual writing you explore, and in the way you challenge social media and think through its limitations. So in our present moment, what do you think about the possibilities and limitations of social media writing? And then given that analyzing sources for their strengths and limitations is a key part of our class of 101, how might we be critical readers and producers of social media writing?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I think one thing to keep in mind is that these platforms are always designed to make money. And whenever there's money to be made, there's capitalism. Whenever there's capitalism, there's racial capitalism and gender exploitation, all of these things. So I think then the goal is to find out ways of subverting that kind of, capitalistic impulse and drive and all the kind of ugliness that comes along with it. And so I've seen people, use social media to organize, protest really quickly, right? I love the speed with which things can be done. I remember being in graduate school and the Occupy Philly movement was going on, and they wanted to, organize a support march. And I think that thing might have been put together in like an hour and a half or something, and the streets were flooded as if, they had been planning like they were planning for the March on Washington. So I love the kind of time of social media and the time with which we can respond rapidly to injustice, right? I think there are some of the downfalls though well, one of the downfalls is that sometimes it becomes this kind of, the social media identity becomes the identity of the person whose account it is. So that the depth of their humanity, the scale and scope of their activism, the expanse of their knowledge is measured or gauged by what is presented on this very narrow platform, right? When posed in relation to the bigness of the person themselves, right? And so I think we have to do a better job of realizing that social media is only one expression or one dimension of the totality of a person. And so we have to stop, and this really frustrated me. This probably came across in the article. I have some, younger colleagues who are kind of a part of this woke culture. And I'm not a part of the woke culture. I come from, my grandmother used to tell me, baby, if you're going to turn the world over, don't let them know until they're flipping. Right. And so I move much more quietly.
And
I
that's
think,
amazing. We should interview her next.
well, sadly, she passed away last month. Yeah. But yeah, she still lives. But, and so this is how I tend to move through the world. And I think there people get points, they score points, right? And I've seen it happen. They score points for being the loudest person, the person who says Black Lives Matter loudest. But sometimes these are the same people who won't write letters of recommendation for undergraduate students, who won't read drafts of personal statements, right? So I think that we have to be very careful that we don't reduce a person's political engagement, their intellect, to what we see on social media. And this is the statement. When something happens, for example, to Black people, oh, your silence is deafening. It's like, silence according to Facebook. Are you actually looking at the totality of how people are actually responding to these things? And so I think this is what Facebook seeks to do. It seeks to kind of co-opt every dimension of our lives, so that from the moment we kind of awake to the moment that we cook our first meal, to the third, fourth, fifth, sixth meal, we have to, it's almost as if there's no photograph or documentation, it doesn't exist. And we have to be very, very suspicious of that.
Yeah. So some of the stuff I heard there that I think was really key was the idea that the internet isn't a purely democratic space. So I think that there's often this idea that it's accessible to everyone, and it sort of transcends geographical boundaries. And I think what you're pushing us to do is to be critical of who made these platforms, what's their intended purpose, and how does that shape the content delivery, which is, I think, really important in terms of being a critical reader. So asking us those kind of questions when we encounter these texts. And also, I think this is sort of a theme throughout this conversation, is that there is no one kind of justice work. And that's what you're pushing us to, too, is that, we can't just think about the way we articulate ourselves on social media, or the way that there's a holistic way to understand the justice work we do. And that we also, the other thing I'm hearing, too, is that we also have to think about for ourselves that we're manifesting our values in all those circumstances. Yeah. So that tension you highlighted is someone sort of making a post, but in their interpersonal interactions with their students, they're not practicing those values. So I think that's a useful question for us to ask ourselves is, am I practicing my values in all the spaces I need to?
Yeah, yeah. And also, getting the students, especially the undergraduate students, I try to remind them, yeah, some people will be activists, but if you're a part of a soccer group, a kind of intramural soccer team, or if you're part of an a cappella group, like you never know just how being in community, how that sense of sociality can actually save someone who's going through something that might be unarticulated, right? So all of these ways of being together and supporting each other, those things might not be called activism, but they certainly can help to create the world that we want to inhabit.
Yeah, that's an incredible answer to that question. So you also talk about advocating for various and varied forms of Black writing that advance, in your words, Black freedom dreams, which is a phrase I love. Generous and flexible literacies whose purviews both encompass and move beyond social media, which reflects the conversation we were just having. But English 101 encourages students to think about writing in this way as well, as potentially a kind of justice work that can respond to the most urgent questions they have and move us into juster futures. Can you talk to us about your experience writing towards Black freedom dreams? How does that vision of what writing can do change your work?
I feel like now beside my little campaign, my Biden Harris sign in my front yard, I need a Maryland writing program.
The best possible feedback we could have gotten.
Yeah, no, I mean, this curriculum is lit. Yeah, I mean, you have to, so I was also a drum major in high school. And I was a drum major in a Black band, high school band, but that was corps style, right? And so we were the only Black band in the city who marched corps style. Everybody else was doing a kind of high knee swag marches. And sometimes we would play some kind of more popular music, but we also played very much like kind of standard show music, right? And I think one of the lessons that taught me, even as I wanted to be doing the kind of swanky marches, the cool stuff, one of the things that it taught me as we, switch back and forth, right, is that you have to be flexible. There are moments where the SWAC march or the kind of most recent Beyonce song might be appropriate for the band to play, but then there are other moments where you have to play Stars and Stripes. There are other moments where you have to play the more classical tunes, right? And that kind of flexibility I tried to bring to my writing. I try to even bring to my position as a scholar, right? And so when I teach, for example, at Maryland, sometimes I teach the same text that in a 400 level course that I teach in a 300 level course. And I try to think carefully about how do I pitch it differently, right, for this particular audience. And so I think as a writer, we're always trying to figure out, and I heard you talking about this earlier, how you all teach students to kind of choose what kind of modes of expression are best suited to a situation. I think that's really the answer. Right. And I think the goal is to equip yourself and arm yourself with as many of those kind of registers as you can, and then deploy them as you find them useful.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. And so this sort of flows very nicely into my next question, which is, so what are your thoughts? So first of all, who did you imagine as the audience for your essay originally? And what are your thoughts about having it included in the context of first year writing?
So I'll be honest, I didn't think that there would be an audience. I thought that would be the end of my career.
Oh my gosh.
So no, I thought other scholars would read it, of course. Scholars who are interested in Black studies, scholars who read American literary history, right? I never thought it would be first year college students or undergraduate college students. And in some ways, I remember when Jess and I did this event a few years ago, a few students came to my office, they emailed me, and hey, I want to talk about the article. Sure, come by. And I was like, I was maybe 30 minutes before I was going to teach a class or something. I'm like, it'd be an easy conversation. It wasn't the kind of scholars with the endowed chairs who stumped me, right, with their questions. It was the undergraduate students at Maryland asking these really deep and penetrating questions, right, about my motivation for writing it, about the things that I put in the article. So I will say, you know, hands down, and unapologetically, the best audience that I've had for this piece has been the undergraduate students at Maryland. And they've actually invited me to see things in the essay that I never seen before, and I certainly didn't have in mind as I was writing.
We do have wonderful students, so we'll co-sign that, and they ask amazing questions.
Yes, big questions.
Big questions. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we're getting live through the Q&A. So this is a question from Britt Starr. So I'd love to hear Julius speak a bit more about his choice of the term Black Flesh. Why does he use the term Black Flesh as opposed to Black Lives or any other term?
Good question. And so really that choice to use Black Flesh comes from a scholar whose name is Hortense Spillers, who teaches at Vanderbilt. And she kind of distinguishes between what she calls Black Flesh and the Black body, right? The Black body as such is something that's been created through white supremacy. It's been created through the Enlightenment. It's been created through modernity, right? We have a body that exists because somebody said that it does. This thing is called a body, right? Therefore it exists. But when she talks about the flesh, she means that kind of thing that literally covers the body, right? And that thing that has been whipped, that has been violated, that has been assaulted since the kind of formation of the modern world as we know it. And so that's why I use flesh, to kind of get at the physicality, right? Anti-Blackness is a kind of huge thing that exists structurally, right? But to get at the kind of physicality and the individuality of the havoc that is wreaked on Black people.
That is the clearest articulation of Spillers I've ever heard. Fantastic. You should interpret all of her work for me moving forward. So another question we got in the Q&A was, I can appreciate your discussion of the pressure on Black people to engage in conversation and activism on the shattering of Black flesh that is ubiquitous in our society, despite the fact that many of our lives and experiences are protests in and of themselves. What has been your take on this sense of obligation among the Black community to engage in protesting and activism when for many Black people, just being Black comes with a great challenge?
Wow. Yeah, so I think, yeah, excellent question. You have to choose carefully what your activism will look like. And if you want to participate in any form of activism, right, I happen to think that we have a kind of ethical duty to participate in some kind of activism, no matter what your race, gender. I just think this is how we make the world a better place. But I think you have to be careful. There are moments where and this is a confession, I am very, very slow with email, very slow. And I'm horrible with text messages. And a part of the reason that I am is because those are two places in my life where I choose to be a little slower, right? And a part of what people don't see is that a lot of minority faculty, a lot of women faculty, and Jess, for example, like I just happen to know that Jess does so many independent studies, right? And these independent studies are so useful for students, but they're more work for Jess. And so many women, so many minority people have these kind of disproportionate workloads. And if you're not careful, it'll lead to what a scholar whose name is Lauren Belant calls slow death, right? So you're constantly working, and then you have to do the work of activism. And then you have to deal with the family drama, the relationship drama, your health. And so my advice is then you make the choice about what your activism looks like in a way that prioritizes your health always. Because you're no good to the struggle if you die prematurely, right? And what we know is that Black people die prematurely because of the kind of violences and labors that we are subjected to, but also because as Elizabeth's project showed us, the kind of gross inequalities in the medical system.
Yeah, and I think what's really powerful about the answer for me is sort of thinking about that, we too are people worth fighting for, that we too are just as valuable and we deserve to be care and protection, and we deserve to think of ourselves with the same kind of compassion that we extend to others.
Absolutely.
I also like to encourage, so anyone else is welcome to add more questions to the Q&A. I don't know if you guys had seen the Q&A function. I have a couple more in here, but if you have others, please add them to the Q&A. So another question we had was, the concept of originality, authenticity, and voice is foreign to many students, since many have been indoctrinated to follow a specific style and form. What advice can you give to students to become more comfortable with being authentic in their compositions? And I think we might also expand that to think about, like, what does authenticity in writing mean? Because that's a really interesting question that hearing this inspired me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is what I love, like the kind of jazz ensemble as a kind of metaphor. And this is something like Ralph Ellison gave as a kind of metaphor for democracy, right? Or even the kind of like freestyle session in rap, right? I love it because these people know the form first. They know the standard, and once they know it, they can then experiment with it, expand it, deform it, make it something new, right? And so in terms of authenticity and originality, what I would say to students is learn the forms first, and then, you know, if you choose to break them with a certain awareness and consciousness, that's on you, but certainly learn the form first. And of course we have critiques of the form, right? Because we know that any form comes with dynamics of power and all sorts of things, right? But it is important to learn the form. And the last thing I'll say about authenticity is that, you know, what is it? I really don't know. And I think it's important to always keep that as an open question, because especially a lot of quote unquote Black writing, to get back to the kind of topic of the day, Black intellectual writing, there are ideas about what that should look like. And there are points given for saying certain taglines, right? There's a formula. And so when you don't follow that formula, then it's not always seen as Black intellectual writing. And so one of the things that's happening in our field right now in Black studies is that scholars like Margot Crawford and Philip Bryan Harper at NYU, they're turning to writing that we call kind of like Black aesthetics, writing that isn't kind of overtly political, to show that like things like nature writing, Henry Dumas, for example, right? Writing about trees and flowers, those things too can contain certain activist or political sentiments that when read deeply kind of become clearer to us.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that also just relates deeply to the theme of your piece, which is expanding what we understand as Black intellectual writing into sort of more capacious forms and more capacious genres.
Absolutely.
So another question we have is, since this piece focuses on the time period after Ferguson, where much of the focus was on the Black male individuals who were murdered, how would this piece change or relate to recent events such as Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, and others?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so one of the things that was certainly happening after Trayvon Martin is there was a kind of patriarchal, we're losing our sons narrative that took root. Protect our Black boys. And so thankfully in Black studies, in a subfield of Black studies is called Black girlhood studies. And so those scholars and others have really done an excellent job of showing us how really vulnerable Black women are in general, but also Black girls in particular. And so part of what we saw is that police officers just weren't killing men, they were also killing women. And I think in the piece I do mention Rakaya, I mentioned Sandra Bland, and some of the women who are being killed, but also I turned to the Pulse nightclub incident, right? Which is a kind of mass murder of queer individuals, right? Or individuals who were at this queer nightclub. And so I think a part of what we always have to remember in our conversation about Black intellectual writing and anti-Blackness is that it hits us differently, right? It is a very different thing to be a Black man than it is to be a Black queer man, or a Black queer man from the South, or a Black woman or a Black queer woman. And we have to find ways of bringing the kind of nuances and individualities of all of those identities together to think about what justice and progress looks like for everybody under that umbrella.
Absolutely. So we are currently, we have answered all of the current questions in the Q&A. Oh, we have not, we just got a new one. Having seen the first presidential debate and seeing the responses made by both presidential candidates on racism within the United States and the role of law enforcement within our communities, if you could go back and add or change something with the piece, what would it be? So I guess reflections on the recent debate and the current state of the discourse around police violence.
There was a moment where Aretha Franklin, before she passed, she was doing an interview, and the person gave her a list of singers and said, "Oh, what do you think about these singers?" It's like, you know, Jennifer Hudson, oh, she can sing, and they get to Taylor Swift, and Aretha says, "Gowns, beautiful gowns." You know, sure not to comment on her voice. And so I think this is my gowns. You know, it's like, well, you know, what do you say? it's you know, I think, yeah, what do you say? Because I think we,
Beautiful sound work. The mics just so well turned on.
and I think we have to, you know, especially in Black communities, you know, Black religious people, especially in the South, they love to say, oh, you know, we're living in the last days. Well, you know, it can be something as small as like somebody got arrested for some misdemeanor thing, and your grandmother uses it as a way to guilt you. But I mean, this really feels apocalyptic, this moment in particular, when you have, you know, not only just the vile racist things that are said, but kind of taking critical race trainings and racial sensitivity trainings out of federal agencies.
Yes.
The things that stand to happen with the Supreme Court, the ways in which the federal court has already been packed, right? And those decisions will impact us for lifetimes. The ways in which hospitals are being defunded, right? The ways in which wildfires are being allowed to burn only because they're in certain states, right? And mind you, those are federal forests, many of them, right, that are just being left to burn with very little federal help. So I guess a part of what I'm saying is that we can become desensitized to what really is evil, right? Because the other thing that we know is not just happening in the US. If we look at Brazil, if we look at what's happening in Great Britain, there's a real future that awaits the modern world that, if it's allowed to take hold, it'll be a very different reality. And I think, and just to take it back to writing, I think this is where writing and writing courses actually help a lot, because they expand our consciousness and they expand our awareness, and they make us attuned to the opposition, as it were, or to the counter argument. And I think when we produce students and individuals who are open even to listening to other opinions, right? Which, if we look at the White House, so who knew that that'd be such a grand thing? Just the ability to consider the other side, right? I think it's something that can help save us from the course that we're on.
Yeah, and I think too that this generally returns us to one of your earlier points about sort of Black joy as a site for creation. Is that's one of the things I admire about other conversations we've had, is this idea of the capacity for writing and work to imagine new worlds and to build new worlds. And I think that's what you're talking about here, is that in the depth of such profound crisis that can feel overwhelming, and just the grief can be difficult to overcome. I think that what you're suggesting, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that we can turn to sort of our production, our writing, and our creativity to imagine new worlds that we might want to live in. Because we are in a moment where the world we live in now is over. We're not going to live in the same one anymore, for many reasons.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's like, you know, it's interesting to think about those debate performances as writing, right? You know, if this were a writing exercise, then what you know, so I think writing teaches a certain kind of discipline. But if we were to convert those performances into some kind of evaluation on the writing, as it were, then I think we have a lot of answers about what's good writing and what's not.
So we have a wonderful closing question from an attendee, which is, the world feels so heavy. If you could recommend one book, article, text that you've read recently that sparked joy, I'd really appreciate it.
I've read and I've been around a lot that sparks joy. Food, people. I'm trying to think about one.
We can take more than one. We can always take more joy.
I love Afrobeat and soca music. DeVito has a song called "If." I've been listening to that a lot. And also I heard a song by Justin Bieber with Chance the Rapper last week. I'm forgetting the title of it, but it was also a great song and it made me happy.
Well, thank you. I think we're all gonna go look at those immediately after this conversation. I think we all need a little bit of joy. But so we have about 7 minutes left. Would you like to say anything, Jess, or?
I just want to say thank you so much. I cried about 6 times during the session. It was just fantastic. And so I feel like the students really, I'm just very excited for the connections that they're making, and that I hope they can see just how wonderful our faculty here at UMD, and especially Dr. Fleming. I'm sure your classes will be full for the next few years. And if you could be in your office, you'd have a long, long line of students after today. We had about 100 attendees today, which when we did this session years ago, the room was packed and we were almost sitting on each other's laps, which would be virtually impossible now. But this is even more than the number of people that could have fit into 115. So I'm not surprised that your work and your generosity has attracted so many people, Julius, and I'm just so, again, impressed and grateful that you've taken the time to spend with our 101 students who oftentimes, you know, it's really great for them to be able to see how important their 101 class is and to see that this is a kind of work that's going to be important for them for the rest of their lives. So it's nice. I'm sure all of our instructors are feeling energized and excited by what you've said too. So I just want to thank you from like the bottom of my heart for you taking the time. I know you're extremely busy and this takes a lot of work, and I bet you're going to turn off the screen and take a nap, because it's a lot of work through Zoom, because you also don't have the downtime and the shuffling and people getting up to get snacks and things like that. So I'm just really grateful, and I'm grateful for everyone here. We have recorded the event, and so I'm glad that other students who I know had classes or weren't able to be here will be able to be here. I want to say thank you too for the captioning. It's really important for us to make these events accessible, and I'm glad that people can access this because it's incredibly important for all of our students. So thank you to Elizabeth too. What a great interlocutor she was. And so I'm really appreciative. My son was having art class next to me, so I was glad not to be distracted by what he was doing. So I appreciate you all. So thank you so much all. I hope you all have a wonderful and safe weekend. Please take care of yourselves. And Julius, I'll be sending you a humongous thank you note in about 10 seconds. So
thank you, Jess.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.